Hello, everyone. This is Regular Guy, and today I'm going to do my best to demystify the U.S. Constitution and make it very easy for anyone to read. So, the reason that today's date is on the screen here is maybe just fortuitous. I went to make a readable copy of the Constitution, make a PDF, and that's what was at the top of the page. So, timing may be on point here. So there's a couple things that I want to say up front. This Constitution was drafted in 1787. All right, and that 1789 was the year that all the action occurred. It got ratified and all that stuff, but the actual words on paper got written in 1787. Now, the people who put the words on paper, you never heard of most of them. All right, their names are down here. I don't even know how many there were. Not that many, a few dozen. That's everybody who wrote it, I mean, Washington was there as president, but I don't think he actually was involved in writing the thing. Now, everybody did expect him to be the president, but what really happened was that these people that you see here, these names, they were the people living in their respective states who, for whatever reason, thought, we have to get together in a room and create some kind of new government. Okay. Now, there are a few names here that you might recognize. All right. Like 3, 4. I don't know. I recognize off the top of my head, not that many. And so, yeah, you don't know probably who most of these people were. All right. Anybody who wants to talk about the framers and the founding fathers and this and this and that. I don't know. Here's their names. Okay. I don't even know what that means. All right. It's a colon in somebody's name. I'm not even going to Google it. All right. So they sat in a room in 1787. Now, it wasn't like there was huge popular demand for these people to go to Philadelphia and meet in a room. Nobody, was insistent. Like New Yorkers weren't picketing outside Alexander Hamilton's home and saying, "Go to Philadelphia and create a government for us." Alexander Hamilton had to have that ambition. All right, that was a choice that he made, and he had to set up this conference basically with some other people. I don't even think he organized. I don't know who organized it. I don't know who to believe. Even if they told you who organized it, how would you know? If you weren't in that room, you wouldn't know what was said in that room. So, again, I said the purpose here was to demystify the Constitution. Maybe I'm doing the opposite here, but the first thing I want to point out is that this "we the people." Well, we the people in the room who wrote that, I don't know who they were. Okay, neither do you. All right. So, when you write a list, like a shopping list or something like that, whatever you put at the top is usually the most important thing. It's whatever inspired you to make that list. Well, these people were inspired to get in a room and draw up a document that described a government that didn't exist yet. And then they were going to go sell it to state governments. They were going to, go to all the states and they were going to say, "Hey, will you sign up for this union?" Like a petition, right? And then see if the states will buy into it, right? So they draw it up, and just this government doesn't exist. There's no United States of America. Okay, that didn't exist. Okay. It was just hypothetical. So the first thing they imagine is, well, we're going to run it. Like the government's going to be, first and foremost, going to be us people in the room here. So it's going to be Congress. We're going to be in it. So that's the first thing to understand. When they start talking about Congress here and they start talking about what powers Congress is going to have, most of the time they're just thinking about what powers they themselves wanted to have, right? They did think about the future a little bit. They're like, okay, in the future, you got to be 25 and, blah, 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 7 years a citizen to get in. But the main thing is, it's going to be us. That's why it's Article 1, Section 1 says, all these legislative powers go to all the lawmaking power, all the power is going to belong to us. Now, as you go through Section 2 and 3, first of all, this part here, they screwed up, okay? This whole section here. There's like a grammar error and something like, they misplaced a comma. And they're supposed to fix it later, and they never got around to it. So now we have an act of Congress that actually determines how many representatives a state gets. But whatever, so you can kind of skip over that part. And then the senators, they weren't elected back then. They were just from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, not chosen by you. You didn't get to vote for your senator until 1917. Now, back then, I think they were thinking that the Senate would be more like the House of Lords over in England. It'd just be rich, old, landed aristocrats with, some connection to the land. And the idea is that people like that aren't going to tolerate, anything too extreme. And they're going to be preservers of tradition, okay? And so they're going to sit there as a check against this elected branch. So the people writing this document, they weren't sure that they were going to become senators, okay? Weren't sure that, they were going to meet the qualifications. And they did say later, senators have to be 30 and they have to be 9 years citizens. Reps only had to be 25 and 7 years. So lower threshold for qualifying for House reps. But anyway, senators, the other thing is that there's only 2 per state. And they did have a formula up there for expanding the number of representatives over time. So they did expect that this House of Representatives was going to get bigger relative to the Senate. And I think they expected it to have more influence generally over kind of the ebb and flow of government. Now, it's not like that now because we ratified the 17th Amendment and now we elect senators. So a lot of the rationale that went into the organization of Congress and this Constitution was essentially rendered obsolete, you could argue, when we ratified the 17th Amendment, right? Why even create a bicameral legislature? Why have your legislature broken up into a House and Senate if both of them are going to be elected? If you're gonna, if you want the whole legislature 100% elected, then you could just create a House of Representatives and have the House of Representatives be the legislature and just have everything the Senate does. You could have the House of Representatives do that too. If the president needs to confirm some Supreme Court justices, then have the House vote on them. You don't need a Senate. Or if you need to ratify a treaty. So, a lot of the stuff that's going on here is just division of labor between these 2 legislative bodies, but you can go back and look at it in retrospect and question whether any of it really needs to be there, okay, anymore. All right, so Section 6, they're all going to get compensation for services. Now, that's supposed to be a big deal. I mean, there's 2 ways of looking at this. One of them is that the people that are sitting in the room that are writing this are saying, well, we got to give ourselves a paycheck, right? We got to get paid. But the other side of that is that if you don't pay them, and if you don't pay them, or if you don't pay them enough, then they're going to start looking for ways to supplement their income. And they're going to become corrupt. They're going to take bribes. And so there's an argument to be made that you want to pay these people a lot, okay, so that they have an incentive to be loyal to the government, okay. The other thing is that if you supposedly create or hypothetically create a legislature and you limit the salaries to like $15,000 a year or something like that, some monthly stipend or something like that, where you hardly get paid any money to become a member of Congress. Well, what you're doing is you're ensuring that the only people who are actually going to run for Congress are going to be people who are already so rich that they don't need that income, right? However, if the job pays well enough that, it's an upgrade for the average worker, then there's an incentive to run for Congress, even if you're not already rich. And so there are arguments to be made in favor of, really keeping that compensation level high, even though it cuts against like our gut instincts. Okay. Now, the other thing that the people in the room were worried about was anybody messing with them or doing anything like, asking them questions or, So they're saying, hey, look, when we're, doing our thing, our business, we're untouchable. Okay. Um, you know, there was no FBI back. There was no like federal law enforcement really for a while. But they imagine the president, maybe having some, I don't know, a posse or something that could go and harass members of Congress, and they're saying, nope, that's going to be unconstitutional, right? They're giving themselves all kinds of. Now, notice they haven't said a whole lot about what they're going to do. Okay, let's look back here. They told us they're going to have all these legislative powers, all legislative powers. Nobody else is going to have any legislative powers. Okay, all of them belong to us. And then they tell you the qualifications, and then they tell you they're going to get paid. But, if you've read this far in the document, let's say you're just reading this for the first time, you might be wondering, okay, what the hell am I paying you to do? Like, is there some kind of all right, they tell you down here, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. That sort of makes sense. If you think the senators are just going to be old landed aristocrats, then it doesn't make sense for them to be in charge of raising money for the government or deciding what should be funded or all that. Let the elected branch do that. Now that we elect both, it's just kind of, everybody, it doesn't make any sense, right? You can skip that section. See, this is the section here that, if they really wanted to be honest with us, they would have made this like section 2 or section 1, really. I mean, this is why they made the document. This is why they sat down in the room and wrote it. It's because they wanted to give themselves a whole bunch of power. All right. So they're sitting in a room, these, a few dozen delegates from all these states. Let's go back down there and, look at the names. There they are. All right. So they all had to sit down and agree on something. They didn't agree on a lot of stuff. Okay. They may not have agreed on like 99% of the topics that were discussed, but they had to come up with some language. And if they didn't come up with language, there wasn't going to be a government that would give them power. So they had to agree that Congress is going to have the power to lay and collect taxes. All right. That was agreed upon. It seemed like that was the number one priority. It's the first thing they list. Okay. Damn sure going to collect taxes, and duties, imposts, pay debts. Okay. And then they get down here, provide for the common defense and general welfare. Well, it's kind of funny. Most scholars of government would say, well, provide for the common defense. That's the first thing the government's supposed to do. But Congress, these people put that, I don't know, that's like number 5 or something here on the list. And then, the general welfare there's that too. And then they're, back to the taxes things and the duties thing, So the common defense and the general welfare just kind of get sandwiched in there. So, all right. And then there's more stuff about money. There's more stuff. There's more stuff, there's where, Congress gets to control everything related to citizenship and all that. They call it uniform rule of, All right. Then there's more money. And there's more money stuff. All right, now finally we get to the stuff they can spend the money on. They can spend money on that stuff. You might think like, wait a minute, why were post offices and post roads, like how the hell that make it onto the list? Like some of this other stuff seems pretty important. It's because at that time in the 18th century, a lot of people were obsessed with like ancient Rome and ancient Persia and these ancient empires. And these ancient empires were famous for the road building, and they made, and the purpose of the roads was to carry parcels and made a big deal out of it and all kinds of stuff. So it was kind of, I don't know, that's how you did it back then. You made it out of post roads. And then, later on, they build highways and stuff. But if you ask them, hey, where'd you get the authority to build that highway? They say, well, it's a post road. The U.S. Postal Service is going to use that road, right? Deliver mail. All right, promote. This is where you get your, your intellectual property. Okay, all right, intellectual property, like it doesn't come from Zeus. All right, like the government created it. It's just artificial. All right, and they did it for a reason. It was to promote progress. All right, forget the science, the useful arts, forget all that stuff. Limited times. Okay, so for promote progress, that's what we're trying to do. That let's think about science. Promote the progress of science. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to give the scientist a temporary monopoly. It's going to be a limited monopoly, exclusive right. These are the only words that matter. Okay, limited times, exclusive, and that's to promote science. All right, that's why patents exist. I mean, copyright's there for creative stuff too, the writings and stuff. But the thing is, today we make a big distinction between creative work, or we're supposed to be making a distinction between creative work and then inventions. Like inventing a device. So if you write a book or write a song, that's creative. That's covered by copyright. That's supposed to be like a writing, And then if you invent like some new type of engine or something, we wouldn't call that a discovery. We'd call it an invention. But whatever. The rules were different back then, so it's all really screwy. And that's the whole point of this video, is that the Constitution, it's not written that well. Okay, so constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. Now, it's the first time a court gets mentioned, right? I'm like, okay, I guess there's going to be a Supreme Court. If you go up through here and you look at this part, they don't mention courts until you get down here, and then they tell you there's going to be tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. They don't even capitalize Supreme. So they're giving you a heads up here that there's going to be a Supreme Court. But if you're reading this for the first time, you might be wondering, like, what? Okay, like, what? Okay, what's that? And then you come down here, define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the law of nations. Now, think about this for a second. Why doesn't it just say define and punish piracies and felonies? Like, why make it on the high seas? And because doesn't Congress just sit there and pass laws against like murder in general? Like if you rob a bank or something, then that's like, doesn't that violate federal law? That's not in the high seas. Why don't they just say, define and punish piracies and felonies? Well, I'm going to tell you right now that this document doesn't answer that question. Okay. Doesn't answer that question. It just doesn't. To declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal. Now, what does that mean, declare war? All right. Again, a lot of people would look at this and say, well, we haven't been adhering to the Constitution because we never declare war. Well, okay, it may be the case that Congress isn't passing laws that have the words declaration of war at the top. They could do that, right? Presumably, declaration would at least be capitalized there. They didn't even capitalize it here. Okay. They capitalized war. Okay. Declares not capitalized. So, how do you declare something? Well, there's a lot of different ways you can do it. You can declare things with sign language. You can declare things with, pictograms or something like that. Okay. So, how Congress declares war, some people would argue, is really up to Congress. It doesn't have to say declaration of war at the top. If Congress says, we're authorizing the use of military forces against, blah, 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 they might say that that constitutes declaration of war. We declared that, the president could go and use the military to do this, right? You could also argue that if Congress authorizes, $10 billion to be spent shooting missiles at a country, that Congress, when it passed that law, declared war on that country. And they can make that argument. All right. The people who wrote this document weren't interested in putting themselves in handcuffs and putting restrictions on what they could do. Right. And so to say that Congress hasn't declared war If you want to make that argument, then you're presuming that you have authority to tell Congress what it means to declare war. And the people who wrote this document were like, that they weren't interested in your opinion too much. I don't think on that topic. And we back up here, if you really want to look at what's going on here, they're saying we're going to decide for ourselves, who gets to be a member of the House. You don't have any say. We want to kick somebody out. That's up to us. Right. Now, here's another. To punish its members for disorderly behavior, we have the right to do that. Us. We determine the rules. We decide. We decide whether someone, gets expelled. Now, this is kind of interesting. We're used to having a congressional record that records everything and tells us everything that was said in Congress. And we think like, Congress must just be required to publish, like transcripts of everything it's done. Well, first of all, I don't think everything, even now, that Congress does gets put in the congressional record. I can't prove that, but reason to believe that. But if you read what the actual Constitution it says, it just says that from time to time they'll publish a journal, and then they can accept you can redact the parts that you think in your judgment, as a member of Congress requires secrecy, right? So anyhow, they were worried about this adjournment thing. A part of the reason for that is because they're creating this club, right? They knew that the people that were creating this document, they knew like we're going to create this new Congress, and we're going to have all these rules, for getting elected or getting appointed by the state legislature or whatever. But then you don't know, first of all, whether people who take the job are actually going to show up and do the job. Okay, they're going to get a compensation. But, suppose you get elected to Congress and then you just never show up. Congress meets and you just never show up. Well, you still get a compensation, right? That's no good. So they wanted to have rules in place to deal with, circumstances where nobody in Congress wants to convene. And actually, one of the ways they cured that is by giving the president some control over whether Congress meets. In other words, if Congress is sitting around lazy and they never want to meet, never want to, convene, pass laws, there are things the president can do to, make them meet, make them do something. And by the same token, if there are, enough members of Congress who meet and there are a bunch of holdouts who don't want to, want to stay at home, don't want to do anything, this Constitution allows Congress to go ahead and conduct its business anyway. Right. So these are all kind of measures that are in place to guard against lazy congressmen doing nothing. You also have to worry about lazy presidents doing nothing and lazy judges doing nothing, because remember, you're creating a government from scratch. If I created a government from scratch in my, my town, and maybe I get my neighbors to sign up for it and say, yeah, we'll do it. But then, nobody may show up after the first two meetings, and that might be the end of our government. Right. Now, Congress can raise and support armies, but they can't use that money for longer than 2 years. And that's kind of weird. Well, you'd think like these people are giving themselves power, and they're just like, well, I have power to do this, and we're going to spend money on this, and we're going to spend money on that. But armies, they only get to spend money that's good for 2 years. So what that means is just the checks bounce after 2 years. The army can't the army's got a credit card it uses to put gas in the tank. The credit card stops working on after 2 years. Okay, the bank accounts don't work. That's a constitutional thing. Congress can't do anything about that. Congress can't say, well, here's a special law that doesn't, it's money that never expires. They can't do that. And I think the reason is so that you can't have a president that runs around and torments the whole country with the army forever. If Congress wrote a law that says, here's $100 billion you can use for the army and you can spend it as you see fit for the next, I don't know, for forever. These funds never expire. 20 years later, the president could still be using that money right? To fund an army that's doing all kinds of terrible stuff and there's nothing you can do about it. But if the money expires after 2 years, and that means that the president can't beat you up for more than 2 years, not without Congress's permission. Congress has to come back to Congress and say, I need more money. All right, the Navy, they weren't so worried about that. They're like the Navy, they don't have the 2-year limit. They can do whatever. Okay, what's down here? The militia. The reason that they had militia back then was because there was no army. And you just kicked out England, right? We put together an army that kicked out England. But then once that was done, there was no reason to keep that army together, right? There was no war. So everybody went home. And then they went back to their states. And then the individual states had to raise their own militia. There was no other army to protect anyone. So at the time that this Constitution was being written, that was the only thing that was defending the continental, or what would become the United States, where these militia, whatever militia states could put up. So what they were trying to do here was kind of twofold. They were trying, on the one hand, to create a big national army, okay, that could protect the whole country. But nobody was sure that they could do that. There were people in the room who doubted that Congress and the president could ever get it together enough to, raise enough taxes and convince enough people to enlist in an army that was big enough to, defend the whole 13 colonies. And so a lot of people said, well, we have to assume that these militia are going to continue to exist for the time being. And so there's lots of rules in here for arming and disciplining the militia. And that's separate from the rules that, for the army. All right. But what's happening here is that this government that's going to, exist if this Constitution comes into it, if it gets ratified, notice that this government's going to take control. These state militia, that's what they're saying. They're saying, we may not have an army on day one, but at the very least, we're going to have the ability to command your militia, okay? Or the president's going to have that ability. Now, I almost skipped over this part. I guess if you pick up a book on constitutional law, or you ask, I don't know, a constitutional law authority about the necessary and proper clause, they're going to have to do a really awkward dance if they're trying to defend, some of the way that clause has been interpreted over the years, okay? What this says is that, this Congress has all these powers: raise and support armies, call forth the militia, discipline the militia. I don't know what to say. Create the District of Columbia, I guess that's what that is, or something. I don't know. And then they say at the very last thing, to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Foregoing. So these are the powers that we already told you about. Okay, so these are powers. Congress shall have the powers. They got power to this, power to that, power. So you count them up: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, however many twos are down here, okay? Got those many powers. And then the last one, it says Congress will have the power to make all the laws, pass all the laws it needs. Necessary. It's got that word necessary in there. Should we use different colors here, maybe? Necessary. And then the other one says proper. Okay, that's what the actual Constitution says. Make all laws that'll be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. So let's get back to that post road thing. Congress might say, we got to make post roads, establish post roads, or we want to establish post roads. So what law is necessary in order to do that? Well, is it necessary that they construct the interstate highway system? Is it necessary that they build out, all these bridges and all this kind of stuff that, they might claim that they're doing under their authority to establish post roads? Okay, well, what they'll tell you, what constitutional law says is that word necessary doesn't really mean necessary. It actually means sufficient. It actually means, if it gets the job done, then it's constitutional. We don't look into whether it's necessary. We just look at whether, look, if it can be used to deliver the mail, then it works. Okay, it qualifies. And then proper, we don't even get into that. Screw that. Who decides whether the law is proper for doing any of this stuff? Who decides whether the patent laws and the copyright laws that we have are proper? Well, it's Congress, so it seems. I don't know. Probably not you. All right. So anyway, glad I didn't, gloss over that part. Now, again, I didn't mean to, make this a video about constitutional law. I'm trying to demystify the Constitution. The only reason I'm drawing that out here is because a lot of, people who think there is such a thing as constitutional law will, I don't know, think that there's kind of a fulcrum here, that necessary and proper clause, everything turns on that. All right, then we got Section 9, migration, something about other people. So, all right, yeah, these are limits on what this Congress can do. So we just gave the Congress a bunch of power. Now, at this time, there's no Bill of Rights, okay? These people, the First Amendment, Second Amendment, they're called amendments because they're amendments. They had to be added later on. This Constitution doesn't have those. So there's no Bill of Rights, okay? This just describes a government that's going to exist. But they're like, okay, well, let's put some limits on. And so Section 9 has some limits, but, all right. So habeas corpus, you're just supposed to know what that means. Shall not be suspended. Hey, that sounds great, except in cases of rebellion. All right, well, or invasion, as public safety may require it. So you have a right to a trial unless, there's rebellion or some public safety thing going on there, so there's your rights. No, now this is kind of a neat one. No ex post facto law. Now, Bill of Attainder, I think that's just like, you can't have a law that says, it's illegal to be Mark Zuckerberg or something like that. Like you can't put a person's name in the law or something like that. But then the ex post facto law, that's a law that's retroactive to the past. Now that's a big deal, okay? Because sometimes people are doing stuff that seems like it ought to be illegal, but it isn't. And, sometimes you might even then pass a law that makes it illegal. So going forward, that person can't keep doing whatever they were doing. But you can't go back and apply that law retroactively. If it was legal for them to do that stuff in the 1980s, then you can't go and arrest them for doing it in the 1980s. You can do, if you pass the law today, you can arrest them if they do it going forward. But ex post facto means you can't make the law retroactive. So that's kind of nice. The government can't dig into whatever you've done in the past and say, we're going to make that retroactively illegal. We're going to put you in jail for something you did when you were, 18 years old, 40 years later. The tax stuff, you really don't have to read because there's a U.S. tax code and 16th Amendment and all that. That stuff doesn't really. But it's worth sometimes going over this stuff and kind of making up your mind about whether you think some of it is really meaningful or some of it is kind of instructive. This titles of nobility. They don't want that stuff. Now, I think what they really didn't want is they really didn't want dynasties. They didn't really want people passing on stuff to their heirs. If you really want, what are they really trying to prohibit here? Well, they don't want people certainly being knighted in England while they hold official title in the U.S. government. That would create a conflict of interest. Which government are you gonna? Can we trust you to work for at this point? If you're a prince over in the Holy Roman Empire, how can you be a senator in the U.S., right? So there's reasons not to do it that way too. But you're also getting rid of dynasties. The idea that something can be inherited. Okay, title of nobility, I think, is really something that gets inherited. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. I'm not going to say that the people who wrote the Constitution were thinking about it that way. They didn't have the ability that we do today to go and look at 5,000 different secular governments around the world and compare them to each other and ask which one does a better job at this or that. All they had as points of reference were monarchies. Most of them were dynastic. although there were elected monarchies in Germany, but most monarchies were dynastic, and most historically the monarchies are dynastic. And then if you looked for examples of governments that weren't dynastic, like Roman Empire, well, that's not a good model either, because there was no plan for peaceful succession. There was no plan for peaceful transition of power from one emperor to the next. And so it was constant chaos. And so they wanted to fix problems like that. So here we get to Article 2, and that's where they talk about the president. Okay, so that was number 2 on the agenda. Number 1 on the agenda is us, Congress. What are we going to do? Money, 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 money. Look how much they keep talking about money. But then, we got to eventually get to this something. Who's going to run the army and do all that? Who's going to do the work? Okay, Congress, being a member of Congress, pretty easy job. You just sit around and write a law. Look at this Constitution. Wasn't that hard? Meet in Philadelphia, sit around with, a few dozen people, write this up. Pretty easy going stuff. Ride a carriage back home, do nothing. Somebody's got to get out there and actually run this army and stuff like that. So, all right, got to have executive power. Now they limited it to 4 years. Okay. It's going to be elected as follows. Okay. Elected, but not, Anyway, so there's going to be a president. Now they tell you the executive power. The executive power. Now, again, if you're reading this for the first time, you don't know anything, 1787 or 1788 or 89, you're picking up the newspaper and they finally print, the whole text of this document that you've been hearing about, and you're reading it for the first time. You get down here and you see these words that probably weren't familiar words. Okay. Maybe you understand what executive power is, but you'd really have to think about it, wouldn't you? Most people would say the kingly power, monarchical power, just authority, right? The authority to command you, all this kind of stuff. Here they're saying the executive power, kind of a weird combination of words. Also, the word president, that's a weird word. Back then, it wasn't a widely used term. Most people didn't understand what it meant. Maybe within the context of private companies, they would have somebody that they would call a president. Maybe the British East Indies Company or something had a president or something. But most people weren't working for a company or like that. Most people didn't, in their normal course of business, didn't encounter anyone that had the title president. So it wasn't a word that you would be familiar with. So if you're breaking it down in your head, trying to figure out what it means, well, someone who presides. Now, that makes sense if you're worried about this Congress meeting and getting together and everything like that. Remember, that was a concern. Well, if the president's going to have some power to command this legislature to meet, then that's a form of presiding. He's going to preside. He's going to sit there and watch this Congress. He's like, I'm going to preside over this. I'm going to watch this whole thing. I'm going to make it happen. If you won't come to, that time DC didn't exist. I think that they thought it was, just keep the capital in Philly. But he's like, if you don't come to Philly and, meet, I'll come down there. I'll do something about it. I don't even know what he can do. I forgot. But anyway, they did say he's going to be elected, and there's a formula for electing him. Each state legislature, in such manner as the legislature directs, chooses a number of electors equal to the number of senators and representatives in its state, and that's it. Okay. It's your electoral college, okay? If you want to know, why do we have an electoral college? Who knows? Okay, again, do you even know that who these people are? How many of these names do you know? Why'd they decide to do it this way? Is it a good idea? I don't know. It's what they wrote. All right. So I'm trying to demystify, because there probably are people out there who think, there's some kind of underlying logic or some kind of magic formula that people had on their minds. And well, if you really look at it from this angle, it kind of makes sense. I think it probably just is just they weren't interested really in electing anybody but members of the House of Representatives. They weren't trying to create, the word democracy isn't, it doesn't, there's no right to vote. Even today, there's no right to vote. That we've added amendments that say, well, you can't deny the right to vote to someone just because, they're a woman or, just because of their race or something like that. But you could deny the right to vote to someone just because you're denying the right to vote to everyone, right? You could just say nobody's going to have a right to vote. Well, you're not singling out women. You're not singling out, any other category of people. You're just denying the right to vote. There's no provision in the Constitution that prevents a state from doing that. Or even like the federal government. There's just no right to vote. All right, let's see. I'm skipping over some of this stuff here. But, the only thing to point out here really about Article 1, Section 1, is that it doesn't tell you what the president does. It tells you that, he's going to get paid. He's going to take an oath. What's the oath? All right, before you end, he's going to take this oath. I do solemnly swear. And I thought this was a big deal back then, these oaths. That was like a European thing. These Europeans, they just had it on the brain that somehow if, somebody took an oath, that was going to like make the general public think that everything was okay. Like you could have somebody that's administering a territory and just taxing it to death and people are starving to death or whatever, but he's got to take an oath that says, I'm not going to do that. And then the people are supposed to say, oh, he took the oath. So, think about it, really. Does anybody pay attention? Does anybody really pay attention to what these oaths say or take them seriously? I'm in general, right? I think even going back to the 18th century, it was just kind of like, whatever. All right, Section 2, this is where they tell you what he's going to do. He's going to be commander-in-chief of the Army and Navy and the militia. Again, there's those militia, your state militia, when called into actual service. Now, the idea here is that the states can still have control over the militia when the president's not using them. But the United States here didn't exist at that time. They're going to create the United States with this document. So when you're called into the service of the United States, that means it's the president calling you into service, and now he's in control of your militia. Okay, so that's all military stuff. And then you figure he's going to have a whole bunch of other powers, but then it's just like require opinions, like what? He actually doesn't have a whole lot of other powers here. He can, with the advice and consent of the Senate, he can make treaties. 2/3. You need 2/3 of the Senate. Then there's like, ambassadors, public ministers, but this is just appointments, right? And then, Congress may by law vest the appointment, and the president alone, the courts law, Congress still has some control over this stuff. President doesn't get to, by default, the president doesn't get to determine, it doesn't get to say, oh, I have the power to nominate or do this or that. Congress has to come and pass a law. All right. And then, you can fill up vacancies that happen during recess of the Senate. Now, again, that's an incentive maybe for the Senate to get together and meet once in a while, right? If the senators just collect a paycheck and never meet, well, then they're just handing power over to that president, right? The logic, we get into arguments over these recess appointments and you read about it in the news, but, what people are actually thinking back in 1787, it's not that hard to understand, really. I don't think. Anyway, Section 3, is there anything in here? State of the Union. Oh, yeah. All right. So from time to time, he has to give Congress information on the State of the Union. So the president can't just not talk for 4 years, at a stretch. He can, right? But it doesn't say he has to do it every year or on a certain date. It's just like once in a while, from time to time, Once in a while, you got to tell us what you think. Okay. So, again, the people in the room, They're not imagine you can't have 30 people in the room all imagining themselves being president, right? They expected George Washington was going to be president, and then they didn't know who was going to be president after that. They're like, well, first one's going to be this guy, but then later on we don't know. But once in a while he's got to tell us what's going on. He's got to tell us what he thinks about the State of the Union, tell us what he thinks his recommendations are, what he thinks we ought to do. You can't just leave it to us to figure out what's going on. All right, Section 4, these people can be removed from for conviction of treason, bribery, other high crimes and misdemeanors. Now, this word high crimes and phrase, high crimes and misdemeanors, I'm told, I don't know if this is true, that the reason it says crimes and misdemeanors because just in Old English times, ye old English times, that's how they wrote it. They just wrote the words high crimes and misdemeanors were always written together. No one just wrote high crimes. The misdemeanors didn't mean like what it means today. It didn't mean like minor offenses. It just all four words together meant the same thing. Okay, today we would just call it high crimes, and these are just crimes that you and I can't commit. Okay, bribery. All right, you can't commit that unless you're already a member of the government. You have to be a high official in order to be guilty of bribery. Like a taxi driver can't be charged with bribery, or treason or whatever. Okay, so these are high crimes. Okay, that's why they are other high crimes, because high crimes includes things like treason and bribery. So a high crime is just crime you can't commit. All right, only the government can commit that crime. All right, we're done with Article 2. That's all they got on the president. Okay, that's all this Constitution says about the president. It's barely 2 pages. It's not even 2 pages. Article 3, we're on to the courts. Now, I'll tell you right up front, there's almost nothing on the courts. Look at how short Article 3 is, courts, all right? Now, I'll finish the video on this part because it's the last part that really matters, okay? So it uses this word, the judicial power. Nobody knows or really what they thought that meant back then. Okay, if you want to get into the minds of those people in that room in Philadelphia, what did they think the judicial power was? Nobody knows. All right, they didn't know. Everybody understood that there were they had an idea in their head that if you had an issue, then you'd take it to a court and have a judge decide it, and there'd be a trial and you'd present evidence. But that's kind of an old idea that everybody had been doing for a long, long time. Beyond that, I don't think they really had it fixed in their head what that really meant, the judicial power. But in any case, they said there's going to be one Supreme Court. There's one Supreme Court. I guess, they weren't interested in creating a ton of courts around the country. One Supreme Court. And they said there are going to be inferior courts as Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. So the Constitution only creates one court. And then it says Congress can create those other courts. Now, remember back in Article 1, somewhere up there, it mentioned courts, Section 8. Where is it? To constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court. So they were giving you a heads up there that there was going to be this Supreme Court and the inferior courts that Congress from time to time ordains and establishes. But what this really means is that every federal court that you know of, every federal court that's not the Supreme Court, Congress created it. The Constitution didn't create it. It's not there because the Constitution said, you got to have a district court in Kentucky or whatever. Congress said that. The only court that the Constitution requires us to have is the Supreme Court. Now, you might think the judicial power just means like the power to do like whatever, whatever judges do. But then they go down here and they say it's going to extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, all this kind of stuff. To all cases. They keep saying cases. Like, what's a case? What does that mean? Dispute? Disagreement? Like, rising under the Constitution, the laws of the United States, treaties. Okay, so the disagreement about something that's said in this Constitution, or disagreement about something that's said in the law that Congress passed, or disagreement about a treaty, or some disagreement involving ambassadors. See, it gets weird, as you start reading it on, reading on. It's like, to controversies between two or more states. between a state and citizens of another state. Like they're trying to cover all bases here, right? They're like imagining between citizens of the same state claiming lands. Like what? Okay, I get it. You're just fine. It's interstate, whatever. These people that were writing this, they really felt like they needed to put this there. The thing is, they still only created one court. They didn't really tell us enough about what. Well, I shouldn't say enough, but they didn't tell us a whole lot about what the hell the court's going to do. Because you get down here and there's no elaboration on the judicial power or really what this court, what authority this court has. Down here in Section 3, this really seems out of place. They just tell you that treason shall consist only of levying war against the United States or adhering to its enemies or giving them aid and comfort. So they put this definition of treason down here. Like, I guess, they forgot about this judicial power in these courts for a minute and decided they're just going to define treason down here and stick it in Section 3. So really, Article 3 is the judicial branch, but really only the first two sections of it set up the judicial branch. The Section 3 is like they just digress. Okay, now down here, this is where I said, I keep forgetting what's in what. There is some important stuff here, okay? That's probably like that when they wrote the Constitution, I think they meant this to have to really mean something. I mean, one thing I think it means is that if you get a driver's license in your state, you can go drive in the other 49 states. If the cop pulls you over, they can't say that your license is invalid because you got it in another state. They have to give full faith and credit to the driver's license that you got in that state. The thing is that the same is probably true of a marriage license that was issued in one state. And when that argument was, or when that issue was taken to the Supreme Court, that wasn't the argument that was raised. People didn't say, hey, wait a minute, you should just treat it like a driver's license, or, now look at the privileges and immunities, okay? Suppose a marriage license creates a privilege or a kind of immunity or something of that effect, okay? So let's say two people get married in a state, and that confers some privileges and immunities within that state. Well, Section 2 says that when those people are traveling in any other state, they get the same, that the people in other states, okay, are going to get privileges, the same privileges and immunities that the people in that state have, all right? Why couldn't you invoke that to say that, if two people are getting married in one state, that all 49 other states have to allow the same two classes of people to get married? If Nevada is conferring certain privileges and immunities to citizens of its state, why shouldn't the citizens of every other state be entitled to the same privileges and immunities? Now, you might think like, hey, I never read that argument in the newspaper, so it must be a really stupid argument. But I'm going to tell you right now, there's at least one Supreme Court justice who thinks that that's the argument that people should have been making for the last 250 years, and they just haven't. So I'm not the only one saying it, but I don't know. We might both be crackpots. All right, so new states may be admitted by the Congress in this union. Now, the Louisiana Purchase was done by Thomas Jefferson, the president. It wasn't done by Congress, and there were a lot of people at the time who accused Jefferson of violating the Constitution and saying, hey, the Constitution, we looked at Section 2, we looked at what powers you had, Mr. President, and we didn't see, a power to buy land from France and tack it on to the United States. And, Jefferson never really, I don't think, had a good response to that. I think the best, defense that Jefferson could put up was that, hey, I wasn't at that Constitutional Convention. I was in France when you people were meeting in Philadelphia. I never thought we needed a constitution. Who'd you have from Virginia at this thing? Madison and some guy named Blair. Well, and then there's George Washington. But Jefferson wasn't there. He wasn't part of this. So, people wanted to tell him that the Louisiana Purchase was unconstitutional. He might have just said, you know, deal with it. So what? So Congress has the power to make what regulations respecting this other stuff. Yeah, again, this seems like powers of Congress, not powers. Now, here, the United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. What's that mean? Well, I'm not really sure. I think it means that the government's going to have a legislature that writes laws, an executive that enforces them, and a judiciary or something like that. It may mean something like that, okay? I'm not really totally sure. It certainly doesn't mean like a partisan political thing, haha. But, they meant something there, okay? I don't know what that means. And they're, okay, we'll protect you against invasion, sure, all right. Article 5, they tack that on there, you know. I mean, they said earlier, provide for the common defense. It's like, but they just got to drop it in here and there. All right, what's Article 5? Propose amendments to the Constitution. Sure, you can amend the Constitution. So a couple different ways you can amend the Constitution. Now, I said earlier, I think I said I wasn't even going to read past Article 3, but maybe this is a good place to end. Article 5, yeah, it tells you how to amend the Constitution, and there's two different ways really of going about doing it. It's worth sitting down and reading and thinking about the two different ways of doing it. Now, there's high hurdles that you have to overcome to amend the Constitution. But, it's been done like 27 times, I think, or something, So we did it, we amended the Constitution. You can do it. The other thing is that it got amended by the first time Congress met. What happened was the Constitution got ratified. People sat down and, there were the Federalist Papers that got written, and they were sent out to persuade people in New York, at least, to ratify, because a lot of people in New York in particular were not fans of this Constitution. So, it was a big upset, in a sense, when they persuaded New York to ratify this thing. It really made the whole thing come together. But now, after that happened, people sat down and read the Constitution, and they realized, hey, it's missing a whole. Like, what about us? Like, all it does is create a government. So sure, there's a means for amending it. Well, and so the first thing people thought about doing after the Constitution was ratified was amending it, and it's the first thing they did. They tacked on at least 10 amendments. They had more than 10 ready to go. It's just that it was 10 that made it in. So I think our first amendment was originally the Second Amendment, but the original First Amendment never made it in. So our First Amendment's now the first. But anyway, it was the very first meeting of Congress, the very first time Congress met. There was so much, sort of popular demand that this thing be amended that they had no choice but to go ahead and tack on a Bill of Rights. So, the idea of amending the Constitution seems sometimes kind of out of reach to us today. Like, we don't really talk about it or take it seriously. Nobody proposes doing it. I mean, we'll argue that, somebody is doing this or that violates the Constitution, and we might argue, whatever about the Constitution, but you don't hear too many people saying, hey, we should amend the Constitution. So one of the reasons I want to demystify the Constitution and get people kind of started reading it their own way is so that, maybe they might start thinking creatively about how we might amend it going forward and, fix this and that. So anyway, I'm the regular guy. I wanted to keep this video under an hour. I think I did that. Signing off.